My name is Anna Vignoles. I'm a professor of education and I work at the University of Cambridge, and I'm an economist of education. Welcome to my exp. I think the first thing to say is that it does depend rather on context. So we have to be very careful. What is needed, in a low-income country to reduce education inequalities is going to be quite different from what we would need to do for the United States, for example. But by and large, if we just focus on developed countries, higher income countries, in order to reduce education inequalities, I think we need to do two things. First of all, we must try to reduce inequalities outside the education system. And if we think about what that looks like, a child who is born to a very low-income family experiences things in childhood that are quite detrimental to its academic or his or her academic achievement. And this starts very early. So the first thing we need to think about is how can we support families to help children from disadvantaged backgrounds have a better time of it from 0 to 5 in terms of gaining skills, so that when they start school, they're in a better position. So thinking about the things we can do outside the school system, particularly to support poor families, is really important. And then we might also want to focus on what we can do inside the education system. And the one thing we know that matters most for education achievement, other than family background, of course, is the quality of teaching. There are a large number of interventions that people have tried across the globe in developed countries, some of which have proven to be very effective at improving the quality of teaching. So just take something very simple, assessment, and particularly formative feedback, so that the child knows what they're doing wrong and can improve, is vital for improving academic achievement. So, and I could list many other things, but the point being is that we need a good evidence base, a rigorous evidence base, on which we can base recommendations to teachers and schools about what makes for effective practice. And it's a very tricky area because teachers are professionals, they need to use their judgment. What works in one context may not work so well in another. But in my view, what's really important is that you've got a good, strong evidence base on which to draw, so that we don't do silly things in the education system that take a lot of teacher time and may not be effective at reducing inequalities. In the UK, for example, for a long time, there was a fad to believe in something called brain gym, which sort of tried to relate, physical activity to the way that children learn. There wasn't a lot of evidence behind it as an intervention. In fact, there wasn't any evidence of a robust nature behind it as an intervention. But a lot of schools and teachers adopted it. And obviously, if they're focusing on something that's not working, that's a lot of time and resource that they could use to do other things. So for a long time, I think educationalists, teachers, practitioners have been very wary of applying economic models to education. In other words, many would reject the whole notion that you are making an investment. They would see education as providing lots of things: enjoyment, well-being, the likelihood that you're going to vote is higher if you've got more education. They're building citizens for the future, and they perhaps would reject the idea of thinking about investment in education for the purposes of the labour market. Economists don't deny that education has a broad set of aims and purposes, but I think it's also very clearly the case that for the individual, for the student themselves, securing a good job and having economic security through their life is a real kind of cornerstone of what they're trying to achieve for themselves. So in other words, the actual student themselves may not frame it as an economic problem. But they do think of education and school as a pathway that they're taking in order to get a good job at the end of it. So it's one part of the kind of education experience, if you like. And so I think it is really important that we don't pretend that that's not important for students. If you're living in poverty, it's an incredibly stressful experience, which means that the child, when they're very young, in say age 0 to 5, is experiencing a home life in which both parents, one parent, may be very stressed. So that impacts on the child's development. What can we do to reduce that stress? Well, obviously you can improve social welfare payments, etc., to try and reduce financial stress. But you might also want to invest in parenting interventions, which can help families in very disadvantaged circumstances cope with their environment better and can help them support their children through that difficult phase. So that would be one area that I think there's good evidence that if we invest in it, we can improve the achievement of poor children. But that's not enough. As they then progress into the school system, there's good evidence that if you fund schools at a higher level for poorer children, that they can use that resource to provide additional support for those poor children, you're likely to improve their academic achievement. So you also need to target funding via the school system at the poorest children. We've also got specific interventions that we've got really good evidence on. For example, one-to-one tutoring and indeed some peer tutoring has proven to be effective, and one-to-one tutoring in particular can help poor children catch up to some degree.